we are in fact programmed to like stories, to absorb stories. Before history became as clinical as it is now in the approach that we take to it, history, myth, and legend all blurred much more. Now, I'm glad that we keep those things straight today, but I've come to the conclusion that we can have our cake and eat it too when it comes to being rigorous, but also keeping the element that makes history interesting, and that's the story.
Well, welcome back to the Sparks of Gratitude podcast. We are excited to welcome today Greg Jackson with us to share some of his experience and passions.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, Greg himself is actually gracing us with his experience in the podcast world, where I get to learn from the master in a way. But Greg, as many of you may know, is the host of the wildly popular podcast History That Doesn't Suck, which we're going to talk about a little bit here. So, Greg, we're super excited to have you.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here.
Yep. So I met Greg earlier this year in the last few months, and I wish I had met him earlier because I would have been able to enjoy his podcast for a little bit longer, but I've had a lot of fun listening to it. And it's reminded me, I guess, to kind of set the stage for this. When I was in 5th grade, my mother, I'm one of 8 kids, and my 5th grade teacher would do a American history tour back east. And I asked my mom if I could go on this that summer with my 5th grade class, or a few people in the 5th grade class that did this. And she said, yeah, I think that sounds awesome. We should do that. And so we spent 2 weeks around the American history sites all over the East Coast. And I remember many of them. I don't remember most of it, to be honest, but I do remember how cool it was to be at Independence Hall, to see the Liberty Bell, to go to Bunker Hill, to visit, Concord and Lexington and some of these meaningful historical sites, to go and see the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And I thought that was so awesome, things that we talked about in history books and so on. What I remember the most, though, Greg, was that was the first time as one of 8 kids that I had my mother to myself in my whole life. And I've never forgotten it, that we got to share an experience together. And we haven't had that. We didn't have that before or since. And that's been meaningful to me in my life. And we luckily got to share that around an experience that focused on American history.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like it was an absolutely incredible moment. And on so many different levels, because of course the history, you're seeing things that bring American history to life. It stops being names and dates. You can really tell there are real people involved. You see these documents, they live, they breathe. When you see the writing, you see someone's penmanship. It's Gouverneur Morris, by the way, at least, the header part there. And to do that with your mom solo, that I'm jealous of you, Randy. That sounds like an amazing experience.
Well, I'm telling you, and I hope maybe this is something that's coming, is that you start to be the guide of some of those tours, and then I can take my kids along.
we shall see. That is entirely within the realm of possibility.
Well, I'll keep bugging you about that one. So
you got it.
Could you give us maybe a really quick background into how in the heck you ended up where you are? I mean, you're in academia, you're a history professor at the university, and you teach a number of courses, but where did you gain such a passion for history?
Yeah, that's in some ways it's always been somewhat innate, so it's almost hard for me to pin down. But if I were to go with a moment, I would say it was 10th grade in Mrs. Berry's history class, and she was talking about the Napoleonic Wars, describing how ideas of the French Revolution, which ironically enough had kind of been stomped on by Napoleon, who rose up through the French Revolution. He never would have had an empire without it. But those ideas, this is where the great irony is, those ideas were being exported to the rest of Europe by Napoleon as he conquered the whole continent. the ideas of the French Revolution, of liberty, equality, brotherhood. I mean, really the same basic premise of the ideas that you find in the American Revolution. And that's why we call this the age of revolutions, because these Enlightenment principles, and I really can't overemphasize this, Randy, this is the moment that humanity is starting to really, on some sort of large level, and still dimly compared to how we grasp human rights and civil rights today, but dimly, we have a major part of the human populace starting to think and act and argue that maybe people have inalienable rights. Maybe there's a value to human life that just it shouldn't be questioned. So those ideas, even as Napoleon is actually stomping on them, his soldiers are interacting with the Tsar's soldiers, and those ideas are starting to trickle into Russia now. I mean, Russia's not going to act on those in a major way. The Tsar is going to stay in control for a century, but even with the Tsar staying in power, there's going to be rumblings, and it goes back to this moment. So for me, this was like an aha moment. Thinking about these soldiers talking, the enemies, right? It's not just this simple bang bang in my teenage mind of enemies with guns shooting at each other, but her mentioning these ideas passing, it's like all the dominoes clicked in my head, realizing, oh my goodness, that means they actually talk, right? Of course, prisoners of war. So there's conversation. So they see their own humanity past the uniforms and past nationalities, and so seeing that transference of ideas, the people came to life for me in that moment. And I knew before I even graduated from high school that I wanted to do a PhD in history. I knew I wanted to go down this path, but of course I really knew nothing. I mean, compared to what I would learn by the time I was done with a PhD, right? But that's where the passion started.
Wow. So in 10th grade, before high school, you knew that you wanted a PhD in history. I suppose that's pretty fortunate because most people don't know what direction they're going even after they've begun
Uh,
college.
yeah, no, it's true. And I mean, I questioned it at times. I flirted with changing my major to econ at one point. And, of course, I thought about the viability of a history degree, all those concerns that so many parents and students have, thinking about whether you pursue your passion versus pursuing something that is quote unquote practical, or pairing it with a minor. And I did end up pairing it with a very practical minor, French. So, there's that.
Well,
Um,
and it shows when I listen to your podcast and anytime you throw out some French in there. So,
Well, that it is kind of funny how all this stuff has come together in my life to where, yeah, my education, so many things that my education experiences in my life, that they all have come together in my podcast on some level or another. Even, I served a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ Latter-day Saints when I was young, and those very first episodes of the revolution, a lot of it happens in Boston. And as I'm telling those stories, honestly, I felt I could tell those stories in a richer way because I'd walked those streets. I knew those streets. Even being able to drop some fun little anecdotal things, such as this corner where the Sons of Liberty are with the Liberty Tree. It's right by the Green Line T stop, and so I also get a kick when I sometimes get emails from listeners in Massachusetts, like, "How do you know this stuff? You're a Westerner, right? We know you're out west." Eh, you know,
well, so maybe go there. I can tell by listening to your podcast, and you've alluded to this with me before, but why is story? Why are stories so important to you?
so as I can answer that best probably by talking a little bit more about my education. Actually, getting my degrees, going through the bachelor's, master's, and eventually the PhD, I was certainly trained on how to do rigorous research, and I'm absolutely grateful for that. It's something that anyone who aspires to write history should know how to do, and to question every source, to even if you have an honest historical figure that they may not know, just like when, if you keep a journal, geez, you could get someone's name wrong, that you met that day, just by happenstance, right? You might have thought it was 3 o'clock when some event occurred, and it was actually 4. And these are small little things, but they aren't small when we start talking about something like the Boston Massacre, right? Suddenly, someone's recollection of the day, the smallest details start to matter. All that said, that training, the getting my mind to a place where I know what questions to ask when I look at a historical document, that was important. But in our endeavor to be as methodical and scientific as possible about history, sometimes I would say in the academy, we suck the joy out of it because we are creatures that enjoy stories. We, even down to, I'm not a neuroscientist, so I'm going to get out of my league if I go too far down this road, but I certainly do understand. And from the conversations I've had with colleagues over there, we are in fact programmed to like stories, to absorb stories. Before history became as clinical, I guess, as it is now in the approach that we take to it, history, myth, and legend all blurred much more. Now, I'm glad that we keep those things straight today, but I've come to the conclusion that we can have our cake and eat it too when it comes to being rigorous, but also keeping the element that makes history interesting. And that's the story. You can look up your family history and you have the name of some great grandparent. Okay, that's fine. And maybe you feel some connection because you realize that this is your ancestor. But if you've done family history, not to put you on the spot, Randy, I'm sure it becomes far more lively when you actually have a story from that person. You get a taste of their personality in that moment. George Washington, for example, and just shut me up if I'm getting too boring for you, but George was famously well behaved. But that is so much more meaningful to me when I know that he actually had a terrible temper, because I know how hard he worked to overcome that temper. And like any other fault that many of us have, overcoming it didn't mean that he lost that temper. It meant that he learned to contain it, to control it. So, when I think about these terrible moments that he's in, and even the moments when he actually does lose his temper, the Battle of Monmouth, for instance, the British are leaving Philadelphia. They're withdrawing because the French have entered the Revolutionary War, and now they need to redistribute their troops because the French are going to attack in the Caribbean. And that's more valuable than Philadelphia, frankly. Those islands were super lucrative in the 1700s. Frankly, the slave labor producing sugar, way more valuable than wheat and other low yielding in terms of economic value crops that are being grown in the mid Atlantic area. So they're withdrawing from Philadelphia, not because the Continentals have bested them, but because the French entry has so upset the nature of the war. Well, Washington's ready. He's going to catch them as they're pulling out. They do so, and General Lee, supposed to be his right hand man. If you've seen the Hamilton musical, they do a great number on this. But Lee just botches it completely. He doesn't engage the way he's supposed to. And Washington had this very careful plan. Instead, Lee sounds the retreat, and famously, those who witnessed it, they said that Washington swore at him till the trees shook and the leaves fell. And on some basic level, you can look at that and say, "Oh well, General just losing his temper." But that was such a huge moment because no one had seen him do that to that point, and there's no other story like it ever after that. It's a high stress situation. I can understand where he lost his temper, but when I know that this man at that point in his mid 40s has worked so hard to overcome this shortcoming, and then it cracks, it comes out when he's at his absolute peak, moment of stress. Here, his Continentals are, they could be destroyed depending on how this battle goes, and it's entirely Charles Lee's fault. His humanity shows as his flaw comes out. Well, that means a lot to me when I know him, and that's the case with history. When it's just names and dates, we really don't care. But when we get to know that person, it's the same reason that you look at an Instagram story. It's the same reason you care about your wife, your kids, when they tell you a story about their day as you sit around the dining room table. You're invested in this person, and so even the mundane starts to become interesting. That's what you have to do with history as well. You got to get to where these figures so that you can get caught up in their drama, frankly.
Well, and that leads to your podcast where you decided at some point in time that you were in this PhD, you're in academia, and the manner in which history is presented. You said, I want to do something different. So maybe explain how you started History That Doesn't Suck.
Happy to. So, I mean, there are a lot of different thoughts that go in that, but one of the key moments, I remember I was sitting on a plane here in Salt Lake, waiting for takeoff. I've got this paper in front of me. I'm going to present it at an academic conference. So I'm doing exactly what a young tenure track professor is supposed to do: write in academic papers that'll be published in peer-reviewed journals. That's exactly the trajectory. And I remember sitting there feeling, I'm looking over my words. They're my words, my research, right? This is my thing. And just thinking how unfulfilled I was. The subject was plenty interesting. That paper was actually on Muslim soldiers in the French army during World War One. Pretty interesting subject, I think. And brief aside, there were a lot of them, hundreds of thousands coming in from North Africa. But that's another story for another day. Uh, it was so dry. It lacked the humanity, and I knew that, and I knew I was going to present this paper. I'm always have to give a mild disclaimer when I tell these sorts of stories, because I value very much the academy. I want to be clear on that. I value the rigorous peer review process that we go through, and the way that pushes us to produce the best results, to find out new things about the past that we genuinely did not even know as historians connect dots. But what the other side of that token, and this is the thing that bothered me, was thinking about how I had put so much time and effort into this, and it was going to be heard by very few people, and it would be read by very few people. And the impact for, honestly, years of work on my part would just be very, very minimal. And I would be talking to other people in the ivory tower, to use that old term. And I was feeling that. I was feeling frankly, the elitism of academia. And I teach at a open enrollment institution, Utah Valley University, and I love that. There's some academics who make a big deal out of being at a more prestigious institution. I like that I'm teaching gritty kids who maybe they could have gone somewhere, quote unquote, better, but they have family situations that have kept them here, which might be as simple as they can't afford better. Or I've got someone who has finally figured it out, and they're coming back to turn it around after they got their GED, and how they're going to actually really work hard. I like working with those types, but I knew that the work I'm doing was not meant for them. And meanwhile, I'm looking at a nation where, as I look at the public discourse, this is 2017, and there were a number of things that I would see and say, the paper, and I'm not commenting on either side of the political spectrum, but it's just painfully evident that historical literacy is pretty low by and large, that there are a lot of basic things to understanding how our republic works and why it works the way it does that we're missing. And so as I'm having this kind of questioning moment sitting there on the plane, the man sits down next to me. He with his son, and his little 4-year-old is very excited to tell me all about Disneyland. This is their layover. His dad was less than thrilled, I think, about him talking to a stranger. But I'm a dad from Utah. I'm good with talking to kids, so that cracked the ice. And as we got talking, he was an HBO. He wasn't at HBO then, but he had previously been there. He was in television, and we talked a little bit about my background. And he actually then and there said, "You need to start a podcast." And I don't. It kind of hit me, I guess, a little bit like a ton of bricks. I mean, obviously, there's a huge uphill battle starting a podcast, as you're experiencing here. It's not easy to figure out exactly what you're doing on the technical side, even at first, and then building an audience. But he saw something in his, from his purview, that led him to think I could reach across that void in a way academics typically can't. And clearly he was right. I ran with that ball, decided I wanted to make a rigorous storytelling podcast where I could, reach beyond the ivory tower, reach those who, sure, it'll be interesting to people who are educated, but it'll also be interesting, to those who haven't had the luxury and the privilege of being able to attend college, or haven't had the luxury and privilege of doing that in 2+ decades. And frankly, you start to forget things that aren't used in your day-to-day life, even if they're still important. So
So that's the genesis of it.
that's how we
Well, it all comes together
that's
for me where storytelling makes it fun and interesting, and then you're feeling a connection to the history itself and saying nobody's going to listen to it. Nobody's going to read my paper. So how do I get that? And this guy gives you the aha moment. You should do a podcast. And so you
yeah.
do it. And this is back in 2017 when you started?
Yeah. So I took that flight in probably, I think, spring or summer. And I wrote the first 2 episodes and recorded them and sent them to a few friends and said, hey, does this suck? I mean, am I living up to my claim here? and and across the board, they said, Greg, this is really good. You've done very well with it. And, of course, I look back on my earliest episodes, and while the history is rigorous and good, and I know the storytelling is good, people love them, and I appreciate that. I, of course, you put in your 10,000 hours, right? You become an expert, so to speak. I've learned more about podcasting, so there might be I might know how to deliver that even better today than I could have then. But they gave me that confidence, and said, no, Greg, you should release this to the world. This is a good thing. You got
So you
something.
started in 2017, and now how many episodes in are you?
I just got episode 147 back from my producer, so
Yeah.
I'll be reviewing that for
And
doing
by the
my
time
quality
this airs,
check.
it might be more than that. So,
Absolutely, yeah. Every 2 weeks, an episode comes out.
well, and the podcast has quite an audience now. How many subscribers do you have at this point? I'm going to make you say it.
Yeah. um, as as you're seeing, it's not always easy to have an exact number just because of the way the
Mm-hmm.
data comes in. But we're cruising over a 7-digit
Yeah.
threshold at this
Isn't that
point
the best?
of
So
listeners.
I'm so happy for you that you have that. And you and I had a quick conversation where it sounded like even though you have that audience, you still seem to suffer kind of self-consciousness as you produce
100%.
and present
Yes.
it at events and so on. And so I actually have some questions about that because I attended one of your live events, which was awesome. I mean, it was very well prepared. I can tell that there's a ton of work that's gone into this. And
Thank you.
I
There
mean,
is.
it's very clear that you've put in, like you say, the 10,000 hours to be able to present something, but then make that something compelling to put butts in seats to watch you talk about history. And the event that I attended went through quite a bit of history. I mean, you started from pre-Revolutionary War, American Revolution, all the way up through the Civil War and more, and pulled it all together. And so what spawned the live events?
So I have a producer that I work with, Dossie. He was listening to me during COVID. He's a former television type, kind of like the guy I was sitting next to on the airplane, but he was binging his way through podcasts during COVID, and uh, of course, stumbled upon History That Doesn't Suck, and he knows what he's looking for when he looks at a podcast. He can tell if someone's really enmeshed with kind of big business and not. Uh, Not that it doesn't present, professionally, but they're just keywords that you'll find in descriptions, affiliate of, and that sort of a thing. So he's looking it over and just really shocked because, frankly, this is where you awkwardly make me brag a little bit, Randy. But I'm not supposed to be doing this. You're not supposed to be able to. I mean, sure, yeah, the free market's there, right? But it's the big companies with all sorts of money to throw at marketing that bring these audiences that they
And
already
you've
have on
gained an
other shows
audience,
to
just
bear.
you're recording in your basement and you're
Just
putting good content out there and you have an audience.
Yep. And it's grown virally. It's been friends and family telling someone else, you got to listen to this. You got to listen to this. You got to listen to this. And here I am, trending in the top history shows. And yeah, when you know what you're looking for from his professional angle, I stuck out like a sore thumb. That really wasn't supposed to be there. And of course, he's enjoying the material. So he suggested that History That Doesn't Suck would do well live on stage. And he basically just cold called me, sent me an email, uh, giving me his resume and saying, I want to work with you. And I had been interested in doing a live event. Podcasts do live shows now, but what Dossie was interested in doing, and it's what what we've produced, uh, isn't your typical podcaster sits down with a mic in front of a live audience and does an episode that then is released as a podcast episode. What he was interested in, and I was very much on board as he talked through the idea, was really writing a stage show that's not intended to be a podcast episode. And of course, that meant putting the time and energy into, to doing that. So it's really more a stage show based on the podcast than, being a live podcast, if that
Yeah,
distinction
well, and
makes
I've
some
attended
sense.
it. So anybody listening here, check out Greg's website and see what his tour is, because they're worth attending. It's really, really well done.
Oh, thank you, sir. So yeah, I mean, it's more like a non-musical one-man Hamilton, than than necessarily being a podcast.
It was a little bit musical.
It took. Well, thank you. No singing.
But you had your guitar
Yes,
out. You had some strings, and it adds to
that I,
the environment, the
yeah,
ambiance. It was great.
no, absolutely. No, and thank you. I don't mean to dismiss the music, but I'm afraid I don't break out into any historical raps. I'm going to have to work on that. We'll have to bring
No,
that
but
in
you do
somehow.
bring in the storytelling and humor, and you weave in with telling the facts, with helping the audience imagine the people and the emotions, and then throw in the humor. You bring the modern with the historical really well, and your timing is well done throughout that. So it was a really compelling event. So and I'm happy that I got to attend. So the in the live event, there's something that I really appreciated, which I'm going to ask a question before that, but I'm leading to something, because what I really loved your conclusion, your concluding remarks at the end of your event. So I believe that the world that I live in and the opportunities and experiences that I have are all possible because of countless people in history before me that made sacrifices, difficult decisions, in large part because of a vision for a better future. And that's, to me, why I'm so grateful for people in my past, events in history in my past. And so I owe an enormous amount of gratitude to that. And this is one of the biggest reasons I wanted to talk to you, is because a man who's dug through all the history is to learn from you why are you grateful for history, and who are a couple important historical figures that you are grateful for, and why.
Oh, I mean, Randy, talk about asking me some massive questions here. Completely agree with your assessment. I am filled with gratitude for the shoulders that I stand on, that we collectively, as the United States, stand on, and I would extend that as well to many corners of the world. Oof. You know, I tell my students this often in class. Um, I think that democracy, as I've studied history, democracy is very unnatural, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that in the way that nature would have us die of infections that we treat with amoxicillin. I mean that in the way that it's perhaps not natural for us to fly. We're not birds, and yet we invented airplanes. Thank you, Wright brothers. So to say something isn't natural isn't to say that it's bad. We do some things that are really good that are not natural. Your yard is not natural. I'm assuming you probably have some grass that you mow and you edge and you keep in a condition that makes it ideal for your family's enjoyment, as opposed to allowing it to be overrun with Utah sagebrush. So in these regards, we have some things that we choose. We proactively have to pursue. And so many things had to align for us to have the nation that we have today. It took people like George Washington, who, confronted with the opportunity to really seize power, walked away from it, engendering and creating a culture and a society where democracy was so well established, right? That yard had been so well made in at your home, that, as unnatural as it might be, when you really think about the environment around you, it feels natural to you, and it's mere upkeep compared to what it was to those who actually installed that yard. People talk about Washington walking away from power. I'm going to give you at least a few instances where he truly did that. I think people don't realize, that are often forgotten. 1783, Peace of Paris is being worked out. The war is effectively over, but we're still waiting on that peace treaty. The Articles of Confederation did not give Congress the power to tax. That was a pretty touchy subject for those for the founders. It was kind of one of the big reasons why this revolution kicked off. But not able to tax, the states were not voluntarily putting up the money that was needed, and Congress was so behind on its bills that you had Continental Army officers who had fought valiantly for their nation, for their hoped for nation, for years, and had not seen payment. Well, most of them aren't elites. They can't just live off of savings for years on end. Most Americans couldn't do that today. So they're so riled up that as they sit in their camp up in New York, they've decided that they're going to march on Congress. They are going to overthrow Congress. They will demand and take their money. They will establish a military dictatorship. So all this revolution, and this is how most revolutions go, Randy. They start with great ideals and they end in blood and often a dictatorship. It's what happened to the French Revolution in 1789. More often than not, it does not go the way that it went for us. George attends the meeting that he was not invited to. They tried to get him to lead them to march on Congress. He refused to do it. So he shows up at their meeting. Everyone's a glower on their face. They respect him. They care about him, but George is not thrown in with them. He tries to reason with them. They're unmoved. In a passing moment, just desperate to calm them down, he decides he's going to read a letter from one of the congressmen, a letter that had been sent to George a little while back, talking about the struggles that Congress was facing on finances. He pulls the letter from his pocket, and George Washington's a very reserved man. He somehow knew how to thread this needle of being very formal and reserved, and yet very approachable at the same time. It's an absolute wire to walk, and yet he walked it. So he's one for great propriety. You do not show weakness in front of your subordinates. He's a blue-blooded Virginian, but in this moment, he's trying so hard to read this letter, and he's squinting, and he can't make it out. His eyes have just gone too bad at this point. So he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out his spectacles. None of these men have ever seen George wear glasses. They don't even know, likely, that he has glasses. And he says in this moment, "Forgive me, gentlemen, I have grown old in service of my country." Puts his glasses on, starts to read. All these officers are reduced to tears. The whole room's sobbing. And I don't think it even had much to do with what was written in the letter. It was in that moment where it hit them. Our commander has sacrificed too. He's given up his everything to do this. And he can continue to be patient for the sake of this burgeoning republic. We can continue to be patient. So he stopped the military coup. He then voluntarily, I won't go into as much detail on the others, but he voluntarily handed over command of the army. Once that treaty did come in, he walked away from it. And then, of course, he walked away without an amendment telling him he had to. He walked away from the presidency. You just don't have most countries start out with someone who has the selflessness and the audacity to walk away from power. It is entirely unnatural for someone to sacrifice and walk away from power like that, to be that selfless. But George Washington was, and we are still reaping the benefits of that today.
That's so powerful and inspiring to listen to. And yet I think that is one of many reasons that we elevate some of these historical figures to such a level, which brings me to a point that you make in the conclusion to your live event. And we talked a little bit about this yesterday. And maybe I'll let you describe that a little bit of your view of how we ought to think and reverence historical figures and also give them grace.
Yeah, because George Washington was also imperfect. I mentioned earlier in this same podcast episode, I mean, it wasn't necessarily my intention. I promise I didn't think we're going to talk about George Washington today, but we did. His difficult temper, and of course, far more famously, the fact that he owned slaves. That is a major critique offered for many of the founding fathers today. The contradiction inherent in starting a nation which believes that all men are created equal, and yet so many of the elites were also slaveholders. And history is filled with these contradictions. We are filled with contradictions because, sadly, we are an imperfect species. And the point, you're right, that I made is that we set ourselves up for failure when we turn historical figures into gods, because it may not be slavery issue with others. Of course, we get to more recent eras, and thank goodness the 13th Amendment came along, and slavery is abolished by that, is no longer constitutionally acceptable in the United States of America. But imperfection is part of what makes us human. And if we are waiting if we expect perfection, we will just be let down every single time. And once we put them on that pedestal, it's very easy for us to demonize them when it is pointed out to us, for whatever reason, that they don't actually belong on among the realm of gods, that they just aren't deity. So it's important that we have the full picture, that we don't expect historical figures to somehow be to be perfect, and to be, obviously we want them to be the best of their era. We want them to be figures that are worth looking up to. It's important to I think question, do we see growth in the individual? And again, George Washington is interesting on that. He stopped using physical discipline on those who were enslaved at Mount Vernon as time went on. He refused to sell individuals because he would no longer split up families. So even as so many others either were not shifting or actually becoming more engrossed in the practices of slavery, which did in fact get worse before we got to the Civil War. Here was Washington going the other way. And he actually spent the last few years of his life trying to conceive of a plan by which he could emancipate all those to whom he owned a legal title without setting them up for complete failure, letting them loose into Virginia, where they would be quickly, frankly, kidnapped and enslaved by someone else. He was working on a plan where they would basically be able to be yeoman farmers on Mount Vernon property. Unable to come up with a suitable answer before his death, he nonetheless put in his will that was basically his Hail Mary pass. Put it in the will. I die. They'll have their liberty, and so he did that. Sorry, I'm I'm giving you a long answer, but the long and the short is that we will always be let down and disappointed if we expect perfection. You're going to have the same experience here in the present, and I would say that goes to leaders within faith communities, political leaders. I mean, even into our own families, right? We have loved ones who you'll hear siblings fight over, the memory of mom and dad, or a grandparent, lionized by one and demonized by another. It always serves us best to just try to be spot on. Let's learn from their best and try to leave their worst.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that a lot, because I have a tendency to, especially when somebody's passed on, somebody near to me, I hold them, I remember only the good, which I hope people remember the good that I've provided to them, but I also have experiences with people that weren't good. Sometimes when someone passes, I'm able to let that go, right? But when it's so far removed, and we're talking about historical figures, whether faith-based community, there are founding fathers, and so on. Yeah, we do have a tendency to hold them so high, which I still do. And this is where my sense of gratitude is towards them. And I'm trying to acknowledge that, yeah, they were having a hard go of it. And what they did was not easy, something that I struggle to believe I would have the strength of will to do what some of these men had done in the past, men and women. And and yet to discount those actions for their flaws is also a mistake in my mind, right? And so I want to grant unto them the grace that I wish would be granted to myself.
100%. I because none of us are perfect, and that statement should of course not be taken to say that we just carte blanche, forgive very grievous errors. I mean, significant things should be treated with the gravitas that it deserves, but the cynicism of tearing down, well, actually, what comes to mind here is the quote that you can actually see in the background. I have framed up there from Theodore Roosevelt, the man in the arena, a speech that he gave after his presidency. He was in France at the time. And, I won't do it justice if I tried to recite it from memory. But his long and short of it is that it is not the critic that counts. It is the man in the arena. He he goes on to talk about how the critic points out how the strong man stumbles, and basically says that is of no value. The credit is to the one who dares to step into the arena, to be bloodied, and perhaps they do not bring victory, but that effort alone is worthy of something. I would just challenge all of us to to give heed to that counsel from Theodore Roosevelt, to not be the armchair expert, the armchair president, the armchair what have you, but first pause, and whether you're looking at a public official, a family member, try to think about the pressures and challenges that they face, whether that's historical or that is in the present. I think 9 times out of 10, we'd realize that perhaps they are walking that path just as well, if not better than we would. And if we have something constructive to actually say that would help them better walk that path, we might deliver that more appropriately if we have taken the time to really consider the blood that has already been smeared across their face and the dizziness that's already hit them with the blows, the bludgeonings that life has already delivered.
Yeah.
Shut up there.
Well, I don't think anybody wants you to shut up, so including myself. Well, I've just got a couple more questions for you. And again, I'm so grateful you're spending some time with us today. So, could
Sure.
you give us maybe a couple unsung heroes that we might appreciate in history? And we possibly don't have time to go into detail about them, but there's a chance you might have a podcast about them you could point people to.
Absolutely. One of my absolute role models and heroes in life is John Roebling, a German immigrant who came to the United States, an engineer. He built bridges, and he's the man who built the Brooklyn Bridge. And everyone said that was impossible. The East River that it goes over. And today there are other bridges, and I'm sure many New Yorker doesn't even think twice about it. But East River is hardly a river. It's actually a point where there's the waters are extremely rough. They're turbulent. Basically, driving some sort of pillar there seemed utterly impossible. And John Roebling refused to accept that limit. He insisted that it was possible. And after he'd proven himself on building so many other bridges, proven himself to be really one of the best bridge builders in the United States, Brooklyn and New York, separate cities at the time, agreed to have him do this. The man worked with just his work ethic was second to none. I really respect that during the Civil War, he was waiting on General Fremont. Fremont, the man who explored much of the West, named the Golden Gate, and so forth. Fremont kept him waiting for 5 minutes. And when Fremont finally came out, he found a card And on the back, it was John's business card. It simply said, John Roebling waits for no man. That was it. So they never met. This was a man who was exact, and he expected others to be exact, and to never waste a minute of time. And as soon as this bridge project began, his big toe got crushed. It became infected, and he died right after the bridge began. His son stepped in, young Washington Roebling, Civil War vet and an engineer. He built bridges during the war. He took on the project. It resulted in numerous deaths, and young Washi Roebling, as he was known, contracted a terrible disease that, well, listen to episode 92 and you'll understand how and why, but it has to do with pressure going down into the depths. It's the same reason that scuba divers need to, at least initially, I'm sure technology's probably changed and different, but they have to come up slowly. Otherwise, gas bubbles form in the bloodstream and can do damage or kill them. And he became bedridden. And so then his wife, Emily, ends up becoming the first real American engineer, woman engineer, that is. So the Brooklyn Bridge is a story of vision and family sacrifice and a bit of women's history wrapped all into one. But John Roebling's work ethic is particularly inspiring to me. And I'll be briefer, but Frederick Douglass and Clara Barton are two heroes of mine as well.
I love that. Well, I appreciate the story about Roebling because I did not know that detail. And Frederick Douglass, I am much more familiar with. So, yeah, look him up on the podcast, folks, because I guarantee you'll get some good detail there. Okay, well, waiting for no man and respecting people's time. One of the things I can do to show grace and appreciation to another is to be predictable and end on time. So, one last question for you. Greg Jackson,
Sure.
what does gratitude mean to you?
To me, that is paying it forward. It's one thing to tell someone that you're thankful. It's another to emulate that, to be like, Jean Valjean in Victor Hugo's famous Les Miserables. He's extended grace. The priest does not have him arrested. He gives the man the very things that he stole, and it changes Jean Valjean to his core. He spends the rest of his life trying to do good. There's no finer way that he could have shown gratitude to the priest than that. And the way I perceive life, I figure I am living for my children's benefit and that next generation. It's not about me. It's about the planting the seeds for trees I will not see. And it is my hope and expectation that I'm teaching them to do likewise, that they will be busy thinking about that next generation as well. And I do that in part because I'm grateful to, the mentors who helped me become who I am, who held me up when I needed more confidence, who advised me and helped me to set good habits that turn me into the man I am.
Well, I am grateful for you and for that insight. And for my part, I do see you paying it forward. And just like a history professor, you learn from people who were paying it forward back then, and you just got to do like they did. So thank you so much for spending some time with us. I am grateful for you and grateful for all those who support you that made it possible for you to have a little bit of time to talk to me. So,
Thank
all right.
you.
And hopefully someday we can do this again.
Be my pleasure.
All right.
You got it.
Take care.
You too.